Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I'm settling into my cozy little Stardew world while we dive into some absolutely relatable mistakes and mishaps that'll help you drift off to sleep. I've been scrolling through Reddit again, finding the most hilariously human stories where people share their most embarrassing moments. And honestly, there's something oddly comforting about hearing how other people mess up in the most mundane ways possible. So grab your favourite blanket, get comfortable, and let's dive into some stories about everyday disasters that somehow make us all feel a little less alone in our own awkwardness. Our first story comes from someone who learned that trying to impress a date with your cooking skills can backfire spectacularly when you forget one crucial detail about kitchen safety. I've been dating this amazing woman named Sarah for about 3 weeks, and things have been going really well. We'd been doing the usual early relationship stuff like coffee dates and walks in the park, but I wanted to do something special to show her I was more than just another guy who suggests Netflix and takeout for every hangout. I decided to invite her over for a homemade dinner at my apartment, confidently telling her I'd be cooking everything from scratch. The problem was that I'd been massively overselling my culinary abilities since our first date. When she mentioned loving Italian food, I'd casually implied that I made fresh pasta all the time. When she talked about her favourite restaurant's mushroom risotto, I'd nodded knowingly and said I had a pretty good recipe myself. The truth was that my cooking experience consisted primarily of following the instructions on frozen pizza boxes and occasionally not burning scrambled eggs. But I was determined to make this dinner work because Sarah seemed genuinely excited about the idea of a home-cooked meal, and I didn't want to admit I'd been exaggerating my skills for the past 3 weeks. I spent 2 days watching cooking videos and reading recipes, eventually settling on what seemed like a manageable menu. Herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes, and a simple salad. The recipes all claimed to be beginner-friendly, and I figured if I followed the instructions carefully and started preparing everything early, I could pull it off without any major disasters. The day of the dinner arrived, and I began cooking about 4 hours before Sarah was supposed to arrive. Everything started off reasonably well. I got the potatoes boiling, prepped the vegetables for roasting, and mixed together the herb crust for the salmon. I was actually feeling pretty confident about my chances of successfully impersonating someone who knew what they were doing in a kitchen. That's when I made the critical error that would define the entire evening. I'd been using my oven to roast the vegetables, and when I pulled them out to check if they were done, I placed the extremely hot baking sheet directly on my kitchen counter without thinking. In my defense, I was simultaneously trying to monitor the potatoes, prepare the salmon, and respond to Sarah's text asking if she should bring wine. My brain was juggling multiple tasks, and basic kitchen safety apparently got dropped from the rotation. The smell hit me about 30 seconds later. That distinctive, acrid scent of something burning that isn't food. I looked over at the counter and saw smoke rising from underneath the baking sheet. My first panicked thought was that I'd somehow set my apartment on fire, but the reality was actually worse in terms of the evening's prospects. The baking sheet had been hot enough to burn a perfect rectangular outline into my laminate countertop. When I lifted the pan, there was a dark brown scorched mark that looked like someone had taken a branding iron to my kitchen. The laminate had bubbled and warped, creating a texture that felt like a particularly aggressive cheese grater when I ran my fingers over it. I stood there staring at the damage for probably a full minute, trying to figure out how this could have happened, and more importantly, how I was going to explain this to Sarah when she arrived in less than 2 hours. My apartment was a rental, which meant I was absolutely going to lose my security deposit over this monumentally stupid mistake. But the immediate problem was that I now had a giant burned rectangle in the middle of my counter that would be impossible to hide during dinner. I briefly considered trying to cover it with a cutting board or maybe a strategically placed plant, but the burn mark was too large and obvious. I thought about cancelling the dinner and claiming a sudden illness. But that seemed cowardly and would require admitting defeat after all my confident promises about my cooking abilities. Then I had what seemed like a brilliant idea in my panicked state. I would lean into the disaster and turn it into a self-deprecating story that might actually make me seem more endearing and honest. Instead of trying to hide the burn mark, I'd acknowledge it immediately and use it as an opportunity to come clean about exaggerating my cooking skills. I'd position myself as someone who was willing to try new things and laugh at his own mistakes rather than someone who pretended to be perfect. With this plan in mind, I continued preparing dinner with renewed focus. I managed to finish the salmon without any additional catastrophes. The mashed potatoes turned out surprisingly decent, and the vegetables were actually pretty good, despite their role in the counter-destruction incident. I set the table, lit some candles, and waited for Sarah to arrive, while rehearsing how I'd explain the burn mark situation. When Sarah showed up with a bottle of wine and a bright smile, I immediately led her into the kitchen and pointed at the damaged counter before she could even set down her bag. I launched into the whole story about trying to impress her, watching too many cooking videos, getting overwhelmed by multiple tasks, and ultimately forgetting that extremely hot metal plus laminate counters equals disaster. I emphasized how embarrassed I was about losing my security deposit over vegetables and admitted that I'd been exaggerating my cooking abilities since our first date. Sarah's reaction was not what I expected. She started laughing, not in a mean or mocking way, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. She said she'd actually suspected I might be overselling my chef credentials when I'd claimed to make fresh pasta regularly, but then couldn't remember what type of flour you're supposed to use. She'd thought it was sweet that I was trying so hard to impress her, even if it meant occasionally fibbing about my skills. Then she admitted that she'd been doing something similar by implying she was really into hiking and outdoor activities, when in reality she mostly just liked the idea of being outdoorsy and had probably been on 3 actual hikes in her entire life. We both stood in my kitchen laughing about the ridiculous things people do when they're trying to impress someone they like in the early stages of dating. The dinner itself turned out pretty well, despite my earlier panic. The food was good enough that we could both pretend my cooking skills were legitimate, and the burned counter became a running joke throughout the evening. Sarah suggested we could tell people it was an artistic choice, or maybe claim it was a new, trendy kitchen design feature. We ended up having one of the best dates we'd had so far, specifically because the disaster had forced both of us to drop our carefully maintained impressive personas and just be honest about who we actually were. The burned countermark remained a constant reminder of my failed attempt at domestic perfection, and I had to explain it to my landlord when I eventually moved out. I lost $300 from my security deposit, which felt like an expensive lesson in both kitchen safety and the importance of being honest with people you're dating. But Sarah and I are still together, 6 months later, and she still brings up the great counter-burning incident whenever I suggest cooking dinner. She's offered multiple times to help me practice my kitchen skills, though she always makes sure to point out where the trivets and hot pads are located before we start. We've developed a much more honest dynamic where we can admit when we don't know how to do something instead of pretending to be experts at everything. The whole experience taught me that trying to be impressive by exaggerating your abilities usually backfires in embarrassing ways, and that most people actually prefer honesty and authenticity over perfectly curated competence. Also, I learned to always use a trivet or hot pad when placing hot baking sheets on countertops, which seems obvious in retrospect, but apparently wasn't obvious enough to prevent me from causing several $100s in property damage while trying to roast vegetables. That story shows us that sometimes our biggest mistakes become the foundation for our most genuine connections, and that admitting your flaws can be more attractive than pretending to be perfect. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that autopilot brain during morning routines can lead to some truly baffling decisions that haunt you for the rest of the day. I work a pretty standard office job that requires me to be at my desk by 8:30 every morning, which means I've developed one of those zombie-like morning routines where my body goes through all the motions while my brain is still completely offline. Wake up at 6:45, stumble to the shower, get dressed, grab breakfast, make coffee, and head out the door by 7:50. I've done this exact sequence so many times that I literally don't remember most mornings because my autopilot takes over completely. This morning started like any other weekday. My alarm went off. I hit snooze exactly once, like always, then dragged myself out of bed and into the shower. I went through my usual routine of washing my hair, conditioning, and standing under the hot water for probably longer than environmentally responsible, while my brain slowly powered up like an old computer. Everything was perfectly normal and unremarkable as I got out of the shower and started getting ready for work. Here's where my autopilot brain apparently decided to take an unauthorized creative detour from the standard morning protocol. I have this hair gel that I use every single day, and it sits on my bathroom counter in a clear plastic container right next to my toothbrush holder. The gel has a very distinctive blue colour and a fairly thick consistency that helps keep my hair in place throughout the day. I've been using the same brand for probably 3 years, so reaching for it and applying it is one of those actions that happens completely automatically without any conscious thought involved. Except this morning my autopilot brain grabbed the wrong clear plastic container. Instead of reaching for my hair gel, I apparently picked up the jar of vapor rub that I'd been using last week when I had a cold. The containers are roughly the same size and shape, and in my barely conscious state, I didn't notice anything unusual about the texture or smell as I scooped out a generous amount and started working it through my damp hair. I styled everything like normal, making sure to get good coverage from roots to tips, really working the product through to ensure it would hold all day. My bathroom mirror was still foggy from the shower steam, so I couldn't see clearly what I was doing. But that didn't matter because I'd performed this exact routine literally thousands of times before. I finished styling my hair, got dressed in my usual business casual outfit, grabbed my coffee and breakfast, and headed out the door to catch my train into the city. I felt pretty good about the day ahead, completely unaware that I'd just made a catastrophically stupid grooming decision that was about to become everyone's problem. The first sign that something was wrong came about 20 minutes into my commute when the woman sitting next to me on the train started making this subtle, disgusted face and looking around like she was trying to identify the source of an unpleasant smell. She eventually got up and moved to a different seat, which I thought was weird, but didn't connect to anything I might have done. Then the guy who took her seat did almost the exact same thing, wrinkling his nose and glancing around suspiciously before relocating to the other end of the train car. By the time a third person had moved away from the seat next to me, I was starting to wonder if maybe I'd stepped in something gross on my way to the station. I discreetly checked the bottom of my shoes, but didn't see anything obviously wrong. The fourth person who sat next to me actually said something. She settled into the seat, immediately made a face, then turned to me and asked if I was feeling okay. She said I smelled very strongly of menthol, like I'd bathed in cough drops or something. That's when the horrible realization started creeping into my consciousness. I reached up and touched my hair, then brought my fingers to my nose. The unmistakable scent of vapor rub hit me immediately, and I felt my stomach drop as I understood exactly what I'd done that morning. I'd applied an extremely generous amount of medicated ointment designed to clear congestion to my entire head of hair, and I'd been radiating menthol fumes like some kind of decongestant bomb for the past half hour. I sat there on the train, frozen in horror, as I processed the full scope of my mistake. My hair was completely saturated with vapor rub, styled and set with the stuff like it was premium salon product. The heat from the train car and from my own body was warming the ointment and causing it to release even more of its powerful medicinal smell into the surrounding air. I was basically a mobile vapor therapy session for everyone within a 10-foot radius, whether they wanted one or not. I considered getting off the train and going back home to fix the situation, but I was already halfway to work and running the math on whether I had time to make a round trip before my first meeting. The answer was definitely not, which meant I was committed to showing up to my office with a head full of mentholated petroleum jelly and dealing with whatever consequences followed. When I arrived at work, I tried to slip quietly to my desk and hoped that nobody would notice anything unusual. This plan failed immediately because my cubicle is in an open floor plan office where everyone sits relatively close together. Within 5 minutes of sitting down, my co-worker Janet leaned over the partition and asked if I was using some kind of new cologne. She said it was very strong and kind of medicinal smelling. Maybe I should consider using less of it in the future. I mumbled something non-committal and tried to focus on my computer screen, but the situation only got worse as more people arrived and the office warmed up. The scent intensified throughout the morning as the vapor rub continued doing its job of releasing menthol vapors, except instead of clearing my sinuses while I slept, it was clearing the sinuses of everyone in my entire department, whether they needed it or not. By 10 o'clock, people were openly commenting on the smell. By 10:30, someone had sent out an office-wide email asking if facilities could check the ventilation system because there was a strong chemical odour on our floor. By 11, my boss called me into her office to ask if I knew anything about the smell that was apparently affecting productivity in our section. I had to stand there in front of my boss and explain that I'd accidentally put vapor rub in my hair that morning instead of hair gel, and that I was the source of the medicinal odour that had been disrupting the entire office for the past 3 hours. She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to process how a functioning adult could make such a bizarre mistake, then suggested very strongly that I should go home and fix the situation before returning to work. The walk back to the train station was humiliating because I'd become hyper-aware of how strongly I smelled and how people were reacting to my presence. I could see people on the sidewalk catching a whiff of me and looking around confused, trying to figure out where the intense menthol smell was coming from. When I got back to my apartment and looked at myself properly in the mirror, I could see that my hair had this weird, glossy, greasy appearance that I'd somehow failed to notice in my morning fog. Washing the vapor rub out took 3 separate shampoo sessions and about 40 minutes of scrubbing because that stuff is designed to be water resistant and long lasting. My hair felt stripped and weird for the rest of the day, and I could still detect faint traces of menthol smell hours after cleaning everything out. When I finally returned to the office in the early afternoon, with properly styled hair and no medicinal odour, my co-workers greeted me with a mixture of amusement and relief. Someone had already created a humorous incident report about the Great Vapor Rub crisis, and it was making the rounds on our internal chat system. My boss was surprisingly cool about the whole thing and said everyone makes mistakes, though she did suggest I might want to reorganise my bathroom counter to prevent similar incidents in the future. That story reminds us that autopilot morning routines work great until they don't, and that maybe we should actually look at what we're putting in our hair before we leave the house. Our next story comes from someone who learned that trying to be helpful during a work video call can lead to a moment of pure horror when you forget what's visible in your camera frame. I've been working from home for about 2 years now, and like most people who've made this transition, I've gotten pretty comfortable with the whole remote work setup. My home office is actually just a corner of my bedroom, where I've set up a decent desk, a comfortable chair, and what I thought was a very professional-looking background for video calls. I've got a bookshelf behind me, with actual books instead of just decorative ones, a nice plant that's somehow still alive, and neutral-coloured walls that don't distract from my face during meetings. I've done probably hundreds of video calls from this exact spot without any issues, so I'd gotten maybe a little too relaxed about the whole thing. This morning I had a pretty important quarterly review meeting scheduled with my entire department, including our regional director, who's based in another state and rarely joins our regular calls. This was one of those meetings where you actually want to make a good impression and seem professional and engaged rather than just another face in a grid of thumbnails. I made sure to dress nicely from the waist up, checked my camera angle, adjusted my lighting, and logged in a few minutes early to make sure everything was working properly. Everything looked good on my end, and I felt prepared and confident as people started joining the call. The meeting started normally enough, with our director going through performance metrics and discussing goals for the next quarter. I was paying attention and taking notes, occasionally unmuting to contribute to the conversation when relevant. About 20 minutes into the call, my cat started scratching at my bedroom door, making this persistent, annoying sound that I knew would eventually become audible to everyone on the call if I didn't address it. My cat has zero concept of professional boundaries and will absolutely continue escalating her demands until she gets what she wants, which is usually just attention or access to whatever room she's currently excluded from. I made the decision to quickly let her in rather than deal with increasingly loud scratching sounds during an important meeting. I stayed on camera and just reached over to open the door, figuring it would take 2 seconds and nobody would really notice or care. My cat immediately trotted into the room and jumped up onto my desk like she does every single day, rubbing against my laptop and generally making her presence known. This is pretty normal behaviour for her, and I've learned to just let her do her thing for a minute before she gets bored and wanders off to sleep somewhere else. What I'd completely forgotten in that moment was what else was currently visible in my room behind me. See, I'd done laundry the night before, and in my infinite wisdom, I'd decided to hang everything up to dry on a clothing rack that I'd positioned near my window to take advantage of the natural airflow. This wouldn't have been a problem except for the fact that I'd washed literally all of my underwear and had hung about 15 pairs of various undergarments on this rack to dry overnight. Boxers, briefs, everything just flapping in the breeze from my ceiling fan, creating what I can only describe as an intimate apparel showcase directly behind my professional work-from-home setup. I didn't realise any of this was visible on camera because I'd set up my angle weeks ago and never really thought about adjusting it or checking what might have changed in my background. From my perspective, sitting at my desk, I couldn't see the clothing rack, so it simply didn't exist in my mental map of what was visible during video calls. I was completely oblivious as I sat there discussing quarterly performance targets, while my entire underwear collection formed a decorative backdrop behind me. The horrible realization came when one of my co-workers sent me a private message in the chat that just said, "Dude, your camera," with a bunch of laughing emojis. I glanced at my own video thumbnail in the corner of my screen and felt my soul leave my body as I saw what everyone else had been looking at for the past several minutes. There I was, looking professional and engaged in my button-down shirt, with what appeared to be a curated exhibition of my personal undergarments displayed artistically behind me, like I was hosting some kind of laundry-themed talk show. My face must have shown the exact moment of horrified recognition, because several other people started sending laughing emojis in the main chat. I frantically tried to figure out how to adjust my camera angle without making it obvious what I was doing, but there's really no subtle way to suddenly reposition your entire webcam setup in the middle of a department meeting. I considered just turning my camera off entirely, but that would have been even more obvious and awkward after having it on for 20 minutes already. I ended up just slightly angling my laptop to the side, which helped minimize the underwear visibility, but also gave me this weird, distorted angle where I was no longer centered in frame and looked like I was trying to hide from my own camera. The regional director, who apparently has a better sense of humor than I'd given him credit for, made a comment about how it's important that we all feel comfortable working from home and that authenticity is valued in remote work environments. I'm pretty sure he was giving me an out to acknowledge the situation without making it more embarrassing than it already was. After the meeting ended, I immediately received about 20 messages from various co-workers, most of them good-natured jokes about my interior decorating choices and suggestions that maybe I should consider a virtual background feature for future calls. A few people shared their own embarrassing work-from-home stories to make me feel better, including one guy who'd apparently spent an entire client presentation with a pile of dirty dishes visible behind him, and another person who'd forgotten their partner was walking around in the background in pyjamas during a formal executive meeting. I spent the next hour completely reorganizing my room and checking my camera angle from every possible position to make sure nothing potentially embarrassing was visible in frame. I moved the clothing rack to a completely different area where it couldn't possibly appear on camera even if I somehow managed to knock my laptop sideways. I also created a checklist of things to verify before important video calls, including a specific step about checking what's visible in the background and making sure no laundry is on display. The worst part was knowing that this moment was probably going to follow me around the office for a while. These are exactly the kinds of stories that people remember and bring up at company events or during casual conversations. I could already imagine future meetings where someone would jokingly ask if I'd check my background for any surprise laundry displays before we started. The incident had instantly become part of my professional identity, at least within my department, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to take it back or erase it from everyone's memory. My girlfriend thought the whole thing was hilarious when I told her about it later that day. She pointed out that at least it was just underwear and not something truly mortifying, and that in the grand scheme of embarrassing work-from-home moments, this was pretty tame and relatable. She also suggested that maybe I should just do laundry more frequently, so I don't end up with quite so many items that need to be air-dried at once, which was practical advice that also felt like a gentle roast of my household management skills. The next day, someone had apparently created a humorous internal meme based on my underwear incident and shared it in our department's casual chat channel. It was actually pretty funny and well-intentioned, showing a generic home office setup with increasingly absurd items in the background. I decided to lean into the embarrassment rather than fight it, and responded with a laughing emoji and a comment about learning important lessons about camera angles and background checks. Sometimes the best way to deal with workplace humiliation is just to acknowledge it and let people have their fun rather than trying to pretend it didn't happen. That story teaches us that work from home comfort can make us forget that our personal spaces are occasionally public viewing areas, and that maybe we should actually check our camera view before important meetings instead of just assuming everything looks professional. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that trying to multitask during a pharmacy visit can lead to a conversation so mortifying that you consider moving to a different city just to avoid ever going back. I've been dealing with some pretty standard health stuff lately, nothing serious, just the usual adult responsibilities of maintaining a human body that occasionally decides to malfunction in minor ways. My doctor had prescribed me a new medication for seasonal allergies that were making my life miserable, and I needed to pick it up from my local pharmacy after work. This particular pharmacy is one of those small independent places rather than a big chain, which I normally love because the staff actually remembers your name and the service feels more personal. Today, however, I would have given anything to be just another anonymous face in a crowded corporate pharmacy where nobody pays attention to anyone. I'd had an absolutely exhausting day at work, the kind where you're running on fumes by 5 o'clock and your brain has basically stopped processing information in any meaningful way. I was also trying to coordinate plans with my girlfriend via text message because we were supposed to meet up for dinner after I grabbed my prescription. She'd been sending me increasingly detailed messages about her frustrating day, and I was attempting to be a supportive partner by responding thoughtfully, while also navigating traffic and trying to remember if I needed to pick up anything else besides the medication. When I arrived at the pharmacy, I was still texting with one hand while walking in with the other, which I know is rude, but my girlfriend was in the middle of venting about her boss, and I didn't want to leave her hanging. The pharmacy was pretty quiet with just one other customer finishing up at the counter. I stood there waiting my turn, thumb still moving across my phone screen as I typed out responses to my girlfriend's messages. She was telling me about how her co-worker had completely thrown her under the bus during a team meeting, and I was trying to come up with appropriately outraged and supportive replies. The pharmacist called me up to the counter, and I approached, still looking down at my phone as I finished typing a message. He asked for my name and date of birth to pull up my prescription, and I rattled off the information automatically while sending one more text. My girlfriend had just written something about needing to vent more when we met up later, and my brain, operating on absolute minimal power and split between two conversations, decided this was the perfect moment to merge both interactions into one catastrophic response. The pharmacist started going through the standard consultation about my new allergy medication, explaining how often to take it and what side effects to watch for. At the exact same time, my phone buzzed with another message from my girlfriend that said something about feeling like she was going crazy. My fatigued brain attempted to process both the pharmacist's medical instructions and my girlfriend's emotional state simultaneously, and instead of responding appropriately to either situation, I somehow combined them into the worst possible hybrid statement. I looked up at the pharmacist, who was a nice older gentleman I'd interacted with several times before, and said in a completely normal, conversational tone that I really needed this medication because things had been getting weird down there, and I'd been experiencing some uncomfortable discharge that was really affecting my quality of life. I then continued, without any pause or awareness of what I'd just said, to mention that the itching had been particularly bad at night, and I was hoping this would finally clear everything up. There was a moment of absolute silence where I was still holding my phone. The pharmacist was staring at me with an expression of professional concern mixed with deep confusion, and my brain was still operating on that dangerous autopilot mode that hadn't yet registered anything wrong with this interaction. Then I watched in slow-motion horror as the pharmacist glanced down at the prescription bottle he was holding, which very clearly stated it was for seasonal allergies, then back up at my face with a look that suggested he was trying to figure out if I was confused about my own medical conditions or if there had been some kind of catastrophic error in the prescription system. He very gently and professionally asked if I was sure I was picking up the right medication, because what I'd just described sounded like it might require a different kind of treatment entirely. He suggested that perhaps I should call my doctor to discuss these symptoms if they were new concerns. The poor man was clearly trying to be helpful and discreet, while also probably wondering what kind of medical emergency he was potentially dealing with. That's when my brain finally caught up with my mouth, and I realised with absolute crystal clarity what I'd just said. The symptoms I'd described, the uncomfortable discharge, the itching, all of it was actually what my girlfriend had been texting me about regarding a yeast infection she was dealing with. I'd been reading her messages about her medical situation while the pharmacist was talking about mine, and my exhausted brain had somehow mashed the two conversations together and output the worst possible combination of information directly to a healthcare professional who now thought I was experiencing some kind of serious genital situation. My face went from normal colour to what I can only assume was bright red in approximately half a second. I started stammering out an explanation that no, I was definitely picking up allergy medication, and that I'd been texting with my girlfriend about her medical issues, and that my brain had somehow crossed the wires between the two conversations. I was trying to clarify that I was not experiencing any kind of discharge or uncomfortable itching in any location on my body, and that everything was fine in all departments. Thank you very much. The pharmacist's expression shifted from concerned healthcare provider to someone who was clearly trying very hard not to laugh. He maintained his professional composure admirably, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching as he processed what had just happened. He assured me that it was fine, that these kinds of miscommunications happen, and that he was glad to hear I didn't have any additional medical concerns beyond the seasonal allergies we were actually treating. The other staff member, who'd been working in the back of the pharmacy, had apparently heard at least part of this exchange, because she was suddenly very focused on organising pill bottles and absolutely not making eye contact with anyone. I could see her shoulders shaking slightly in what was definitely suppressed laughter. The whole situation had transformed from a routine medication pickup into a comedy of errors that I would be replaying in my mind during every future pharmacy visit. I paid for my prescription as quickly as possible, mumbled something about being really tired from work, and practically ran out of the pharmacy. When I got to my car, I just sat there for a minute contemplating the full scope of what had just happened. I'd essentially announced intimate medical problems to my pharmacist, problems that I wasn't even experiencing because I couldn't manage to keep two conversations separate in my overworked brain. When I met up with my girlfriend later and told her about the incident, she laughed so hard she nearly cried. She thought it was absolutely hilarious that I'd been so focused on being supportive about her medical situation that I'd accidentally claimed her symptoms as my own to a healthcare professional. She also pointed out that this was exactly why people shouldn't text and interact with service workers at the same time, which was a fair criticism that I absolutely deserved. The worst part is that I really like this pharmacy and have been going there for years. The pharmacist is genuinely nice and helpful, and the convenience of having a place so close to my apartment is valuable. But now every single time I go in there to pick up any medication, I'm going to remember the day I accidentally told him about genital discharge that I wasn't experiencing while picking up allergy pills. There's no way he's forgotten this interaction, and there's a good chance it's become a story they tell during staff meetings about the importance of clear patient communication. I've considered switching to a different pharmacy just to avoid the lingering awkwardness, but that feels like letting the embarrassment win. Instead, I've decided to just own it and continue going there, though I've made myself a firm rule about putting my phone completely away before approaching any service counter. No more multitasking during important interactions, and definitely no more merging girlfriend text conversations with healthcare consultations. That story reminds us that our brains have limits when it comes to multitasking, and that sometimes trying to handle two conversations simultaneously results in catastrophically merged responses that you'll be cringing about for years to come. Our next story comes from someone who learned that being overly enthusiastic about helping a stranger can spiral into an increasingly awkward situation when you realise you've made a fundamental error in judgment. I consider myself a pretty helpful person who likes to do good deeds when opportunities present themselves. I'm the type who holds doors open for people, helps carry groceries for elderly neighbours, and generally tries to make the world slightly less terrible through small acts of kindness. This personality trait has served me well throughout my life and has led to some nice interactions with strangers who appreciate a helping hand. Today, however, my eagerness to be helpful created a situation so monumentally awkward that I'm genuinely considering whether I should just avoid that entire neighbourhood for the next several months. I was walking through the parking lot of my local grocery store after finishing my weekly shopping trip. It was one of those perfect autumn afternoons where the weather is nice enough that you don't mind taking your time getting back to your car. I had my reusable bags full of groceries and was mentally planning what I'd make for dinner when I noticed a woman struggling with an absolutely massive amount of shopping bags near a car a few spaces away from mine. She had at least 8 or 9 bags clustered around her feet and was fumbling with her keys while trying to balance everything and keep bags from tipping over. My helpful instinct kicked in immediately, and I called out, asking if she needed a hand getting everything into her car. She looked up and seemed relieved, nodding and thanking me for offering. I set my own bags down near my car and walked over to help her wrangle all her groceries. We made small talk about how grocery trips always seem to result in way more bags than you expect, and I grabbed several of the heavier-looking bags to help load them into her trunk. She popped open her trunk and I started carefully placing bags inside, making sure nothing would tip over or crush any fragile items. She was doing the same from the other side, and we had a nice little assembly line going. I was feeling pretty good about being a helpful citizen and maybe brightening someone's day with a simple gesture. That warm, fuzzy feeling lasted for approximately 45 more seconds before everything went sideways. As I was placing the last bag into the trunk, I noticed something odd about the interior of the car. There was a baby car seat in the back that looked significantly newer and different from the one I'd seen this same woman installing a few weeks ago when I'd helped her in this exact same parking lot. My brain, which apparently loves to create problems, immediately flagged this as unusual and worth investigating further. Instead of just accepting that maybe she'd gotten a new car seat, I decided to really look at the situation. That's when I realised, with creeping horror, that this was not actually the same woman I'd helped before. This was a completely different person who happened to look vaguely similar and was having the same grocery bag struggle in roughly the same area of the parking lot. My brain had seen the surface level similarities and just assumed this was the same helpful interaction I'd had previously, but I was actually helping a total stranger I'd never met before and had somehow convinced myself we had prior history. The real problem emerged when I looked past the car I'd just loaded and saw another woman walking toward us from the store entrance, also carrying several grocery bags and holding keys that she was clearly preparing to use. She had the same general build and hair colour as the woman whose trunk I'd just filled, and she was heading directly toward us with a slightly confused expression on her face. My stomach dropped as I realised what had happened. I'd helped the wrong person load groceries into what was apparently someone else's car. The woman I'd been helping wasn't the owner of this vehicle at all. She was just another shopper who'd been standing near this car, and when I'd asked if she needed help, she'd naturally assumed I was talking about helping her get her own bags to her own car, which was presumably parked somewhere else entirely in this lot. The actual owner of the car reached us and stopped, looking at her open trunk full of groceries that definitely weren't hers, then at me, then at the other woman, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. The woman I'd been helping had also frozen, apparently realising at the same moment I did that we'd just loaded all her groceries into a random stranger's vehicle. I tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over my words as I attempted to convey that I'd mistaken her for someone else, and had somehow initiated this entire grocery transfer into the wrong car without either of us realising the error. The actual car owner was incredibly confused and kept asking why we were putting groceries in her trunk. The woman I'd been helping was apologising profusely while also looking at me like I was some kind of grocery bandit who went around randomly loading people's cars with food. We had to unload all the bags we'd just carefully packed, which was made more awkward by the fact that some of them had settled into the trunk in a way that made them difficult to extract. The actual car owner was surprisingly patient about the whole thing, but clearly thought we were both slightly unhinged. She kept making comments about how this was certainly a first and asking if we were sure we hadn't been drinking. Once we got everything unloaded, I helped the original woman I'd been assisting locate her actual car, which turned out to be parked 3 rows over in a completely different section of the lot. We walked over there in awkward silence, both of us processing the absurdity of what had just occurred. When we reached her actual vehicle, I helped load everything again, this time triple checking that we were putting groceries into the correct car that actually belonged to her. She was gracious about the mistake, and even laughed a little once we'd successfully completed the grocery transfer into the right vehicle. She mentioned that this would make a good story to tell people, which was true but didn't make me feel any less mortified about the situation. I apologised probably 6 or 7 more times before finally retreating back to my own car. When I got back to where I'd left my groceries, I discovered that in my haste to help a stranger, I'd left my own bag sitting on the ground next to my car for at least 15 minutes. One of the bags had tipped over, and several items had rolled under nearby vehicles. I had to get down on my hands and knees in the parking lot to retrieve a can of beans and a box of pasta that had somehow travelled an impressive distance from where I'd left them. As I was crouched down, fishing pasta from under someone's tyre, I saw the actual owner of the car we'd mistakenly loaded drive past me. She slowed down and gave me a look that suggested she was reassessing her entire understanding of how parking lots work and whether the people who use them can be trusted with basic tasks. I waved weakly and tried to project an energy of competence and normalcy, which is difficult to do when you're on all fours in a parking lot retrieving runaway groceries. The drive home was filled with me replaying the entire incident and trying to figure out at what point I could have realised my error and prevented the whole situation. The truth was that I'd been so confident in my initial assessment that I'd helped this woman before that I hadn't bothered to actually verify any details. I'd just committed fully to the helpful interaction without stopping to confirm that I was helping the right person in the right location with the right car. My roommate thought the story was absolutely hilarious when I got home and recounted the parking lot debacle. He pointed out that my eagerness to be helpful had essentially turned me into a grocery vigilante who randomly redistributes shopping bags to incorrect vehicles. He suggested that maybe I should implement some kind of verification system before offering assistance, like actually confirming whose car is whose, before loading things into trunks. The most embarrassing part is that I do actually shop at that grocery store regularly, which means there's a reasonable chance I'll run into one or both of those women again at some point. I'm not sure what the appropriate social protocol is for encountering someone you accidentally helped load groceries into a stranger's car. Do you acknowledge the incident? Pretend it never happened? Make a joke about it? I'm leaning toward just avoiding eye contact and pretending to be very interested in produce selection if I see either of them. That story shows us that sometimes our desire to be helpful can override our common sense, and that maybe we should verify basic facts like whose car we're loading before committing fully to an act of kindness. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that trying to impress your new co-workers during a team-building exercise can backfire spectacularly when you overestimate both your abilities and your body's current fitness level. I started a new job about 3 weeks ago at a marketing firm that really emphasises company culture and team bonding. During my interview process, they talked extensively about how they do monthly team-building activities and how important it is that everyone participates and engages with the social aspects of the workplace. I was totally on board with this because my last job was pretty isolated and depressing, so the idea of actually enjoying my co-workers and doing fun activities together sounded amazing. I should have been more careful about what I wished for. This month's team-building activity was announced last week, and it was going to be a friendly office softball game at a local park. Everyone seemed really excited about it, talking about positions they used to play and sharing stories about their athletic backgrounds. I listened to all these conversations and felt this weird pressure building to present myself as someone who is athletic and capable, even though the truth is that I haven't played any organised sports since middle school, and my current exercise routine consists primarily of walking to and from my car. The problem is that I actually was pretty decent at softball back in 7th grade, which was unfortunately about 15 years ago. My brain somehow decided that those ancient athletic achievements were still relevant and that muscle memory from over a decade ago would surely kick in when needed. I started talking confidently about how I used to play shortstop and how I was looking forward to getting back out on the field. Several people seemed impressed and mentioned that we needed strong infielders, which only encouraged me to lean further into this fabricated athletic identity. The day of the softball game arrived, and I showed up wearing athletic clothes that I'd purchased specifically for this occasion because all my actual workout clothes were ancient and sad-looking. I'd gone to a sporting goods store and bought proper athletic shoes, moisture-wicking shirts, and even a baseball glove that the salesperson had assured me was perfect for recreational softball. I looked the part of someone who knew what they were doing, which made what happened next even more devastating. We split into 2 teams and started warming up, which is when I should have realised that my body was not prepared for any of this. The first few throws I made during warm-ups were alarmingly inaccurate, sailing past my intended target by several feet. I told myself I just needed to warm up more and that everything would click once we started the actual game. This was wishful thinking of the highest order, but I was committed to maintaining the illusion of athletic competence. The game started and I was playing shortstop, just like I'd confidently claimed I could. The first few innings were fine because nothing actually came my way, which allowed me to continue pretending I knew what I was doing. I made a couple of easy throws to first base during warm-ups between innings and managed not to embarrass myself too badly. Then the 4th inning happened and my entire carefully constructed athletic facade came crashing down. A ball was hit directly toward me, a ground ball that should have been a routine play for anyone with actual shortstop experience. I moved to field it, confident that my middle school skills would activate and guide me through the motion. Instead, what happened was that I completely misjudged the speed of the ball, positioned my glove incorrectly, and watched in horror as the ball bounced off the heel of my glove and shot directly into my face. The impact wasn't serious enough to cause any real injury, but it was definitely hard enough to make my eyes water and my nose sting. More importantly, it was spectacular enough that everyone on both teams stopped what they were doing to make sure I was okay. I stood there with my hand over my face, trying to play it off like this was no big deal, while internally dying from embarrassment. My new co-workers were all very concerned and supportive, which somehow made it worse because I'd been talking such a big game about my softball abilities. I assured everyone I was fine, and that we should keep playing, determined to redeem myself and prove that the faceball incident was just a fluke. This determination lasted until my next at-bat, which turned into an even more humiliating display of athletic incompetence. I approached the plate with false confidence, took my stance, and watched the first pitch come toward me. I swung with what I thought was good form and timing, but I was so far off that I basically corkscrewed myself into the ground and nearly fell over. The second pitch I didn't even swing at because I was still recovering from my dramatic whiff on the first one. The third pitch I made contact with, which felt like a small victory until I realised I'd hit a weak ground ball directly back to the pitcher, who barely had to move to catch it. I jogged to first base even though I was clearly out, mainly because I needed a moment to stand somewhere and contemplate my choices. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. The absolute peak of my humiliation came in the 6th inning when I was on first base after managing to get walked because the pitcher felt sorry for me. Someone hit a ball to the outfield, and I took off running towards second base with enthusiasm that far exceeded my actual running ability. I'd like to say I was running at a moderate pace, but the truth is I was going all out, completely convinced I could make it to second base with time to spare. What I'd forgotten in my burst of competitive spirit was that I hadn't done any kind of sprint running in years, and my body was absolutely not prepared for this sudden demand for speed and athleticism. About halfway to second base, both of my legs simultaneously cramped up in what felt like my muscles staging a coordinated revolt against my decision-making. I didn't just slow down or stumble. I completely seized up mid-stride and basically collapsed onto the base path like a malfunctioning robot. I ended up lying on the ground between first and second base, clutching both of my calves and making sounds that were somewhere between groaning and whimpering. The game stopped again as people rushed over to make sure I hadn't seriously injured myself. My boss, who was playing second base, helped me limp off the field while asking if I needed medical attention. I assured him that I just needed to stretch and drink some water, but the damage to my pride was absolutely catastrophic. I spent the rest of the game sitting on the sidelines, stretching my cramped legs and trying to project an attitude of casual good humour about the situation. Everyone was incredibly nice about it, making jokes about getting older and how we're all a little rustier than we remember. But I could tell that my reputation as an athletic person was completely destroyed, replaced by a new identity as that guy who got hit in the face with a ball and then cramped up running to second base. The worst part came during the team dinner after the game, when people started recounting the highlights and funny moments. My faceball incident and dramatic cramping collapse were definitely the most discussed topics, with multiple people doing impressions of my seizure-like run to second base. I laughed along because what else could I do? But internally, I was making notes about never again claiming athletic abilities I don't actually possess. My legs were sore for 3 days after the softball game, a constant physical reminder of my hubris and poor judgment. Walking around the office while visibly limping meant that people kept asking if I was okay and then remembering why I was injured, which led to more retellings of my athletic disasters. I became known as the softball casualty, which is not the professional reputation I was hoping to establish at my new job. The silver lining is that the whole experience actually did help me bond with my co-workers, just not in the way I'd intended. Instead of impressing them with my athletic skills, I'd given them a shared experience of watching someone confidently claim abilities they absolutely did not have. Several people told me they appreciated that I was willing to fully commit to the game, even though it became obvious pretty quickly that I was out of my depth. My boss also mentioned during our next one-on-one meeting that he respected my willingness to participate enthusiastically in team activities, even if it meant risking public humiliation and minor physical injury. He said it showed good team spirit, which I chose to interpret as a compliment rather than a gentle roast of my complete lack of softball competence. That story teaches us that nostalgia for our past athletic abilities can be dangerously misleading, and that maybe we should ease back into sports rather than confidently claiming we can perform at levels we achieved 15 years ago when our bodies were younger and more forgiving. Our next story comes from someone who learned that assuming you know what's happening in a situation without actually paying attention can lead to a series of increasingly awkward misunderstandings that snowball into pure social chaos. I've been going to the same coffee shop every morning for about 6 months now, and I've developed one of those comfortable regular customer relationships with the staff where they know my order and we exchange pleasant small talk while they make my drink. It's become part of my daily routine, and I genuinely look forward to that brief friendly interaction before heading to work. The barista who usually works the morning shift is this friendly guy named Marcus, who always remembers that I like my coffee with oat milk and an extra shot of espresso. We've had dozens of these quick morning conversations about weather, weekend plans and general life updates. This morning I walked into the coffee shop at my usual time, but I was completely distracted by a work email I'd just received on my phone. My boss had sent this long message about a project deadline being moved up, and I was reading through it while standing in line, barely aware of my surroundings. I've gotten so comfortable with my routine at this coffee shop that I basically go into autopilot mode when I'm there, which meant I wasn't really looking at anything except my phone screen. When I got to the counter, I glanced up briefly and saw someone wearing the coffee shop uniform standing at the register. My brain registered barista in the general size and shape of Marcus, so I just assumed it was him and launched into my usual friendly morning greeting. I said something about how I desperately needed coffee to deal with work stress and made a comment referencing a conversation we'd had last week about his plans to visit his sister. I was still mostly focused on my phone, scrolling through the rest of my boss's email while talking. The person behind the counter seemed confused and said they'd be happy to help me, but asked what I wanted to order. This should have been my first clue that something was off, because Marcus never asks for my order anymore since he has it memorized. But my distracted brain just assumed he was having an off morning or maybe hadn't recognized me yet. So I clarified that I wanted my usual and added a reminder about the oat milk and extra shot. They asked me to specify what my usual was, which again should have triggered some awareness that this wasn't my normal interaction. Instead, I got slightly annoyed and thought Marcus was being weirdly formal, or perhaps was just tired. I explained my order with maybe a bit more edge in my voice than necessary, still not really looking up from my phone. I made another casual comment about how we all have those mornings where our brains don't work properly, assuming we were having a moment of shared understanding about being tired. The barista confirmed my order and told me the total, which I paid using my card while finally putting my phone away. That's when I actually looked at the person who'd been helping me and realised with creeping horror that this was absolutely not Marcus. This was a woman who looked nothing like Marcus, except for the fact that she was wearing the same uniform and standing in the same spot where Marcus usually stood. She had completely different features, different hair, different everything, and I had somehow just spent the last 2 minutes talking to her as if she were my regular barista. The confused expression on her face suddenly made perfect sense. I'd walked up and immediately started talking to her like we had an established relationship, referenced conversations she'd never been part of, and then gotten mildly annoyed when she didn't know my order. From her perspective, some random customer had just treated her like an old friend while being slightly rude about her not having information she couldn't possibly have. I felt my face get hot as I realised the scope of my mistake. I started to apologise and explain that I thought she was Marcus, but before I could get the words out properly, Marcus himself emerged from the back room carrying a box of supplies. He saw me standing at the counter looking flustered and greeted me cheerfully, asking if Sarah was taking good care of me. This confirmed that the woman I'd been talking to was indeed not Marcus, and also that I'd been interacting with her in a way that must have seemed absolutely insane. I tried to explain to Sarah that I was so sorry for the confusion, that I came here every morning, and usually Marcus helped me, and that I'd been distracted by my phone and hadn't looked at who was actually working. She was very gracious about it and said it was totally fine, but I could tell she thought the whole interaction had been weird. Marcus laughed and mentioned that he'd been in the back doing inventory and that Sarah was a new hire who was training on the morning shift. This information made everything worse because I'd essentially just been incredibly presumptuous and borderline rude to someone on what might have been one of her first days working alone at the counter. I apologised again, this time more profusely, trying to explain that I was normally more aware of my surroundings and that I hadn't meant to make her first impression of regular customers be some distracted guy who apparently couldn't tell one person from another. Marcus, trying to be helpful, mentioned to Sarah that I was one of their regular customers and that I usually came in around this time every day. This was meant to provide context for my behaviour, but it actually made things more awkward because it meant Sarah now knew that I was someone she'd probably see frequently, and our relationship had started with me treating her like a stranger I already knew, while being annoyed that she didn't know things about me. I took my coffee when it was ready and practically fled from the counter, mumbling more apologies and well wishes for Sarah's training. As I was leaving, I heard Marcus explaining to her that I was usually much more coherent and friendly, which was kind of him but also meant they were definitely having a conversation about my weird behaviour. The worst part was realising that I'd now created an ongoing awkward situation that would persist every time I went to that coffee shop. If Sarah was going to be working morning shifts regularly, I'd have to see her frequently and somehow move past this disastrous first impression. I couldn't just avoid my favourite coffee shop because of one embarrassing interaction, but I also wasn't sure how to rebuild from such a strange starting point. I spent my entire commute to work replaying the interaction and cringing at how I must have come across. I'd basically acted like one of those entitled customers who expects everyone to know who they are and gets annoyed when they're not immediately recognised. That wasn't the kind of person I wanted to be, and it definitely wasn't how I normally interacted with service workers, but my distracted state had made me behave in exactly that way. When I got to work, I told my co-worker about the incident because I needed to vent about my embarrassment to someone. She found it hilarious and pointed out that this was a perfect example of why people shouldn't be on their phones while interacting with other humans. She also suggested that I should probably make an extra effort to be friendly and normal the next time I saw Sarah, to show her that I wasn't actually a distracted weirdo who couldn't distinguish between different people. The next morning I was genuinely nervous about going to the coffee shop, which is absurd because it's just a place where I buy coffee. But I'd managed to create this whole awkward dynamic through one distracted interaction. When I walked in, Sarah was behind the counter again, and I made a point of making actual eye contact and greeting her by name. I apologised once more for the previous day's confusion and explained that I'd been having a stressful work situation that had me completely distracted. She was incredibly nice about it and said she totally understood having those days where your brain is somewhere else entirely. She mentioned that Marcus had told her I was normally much more pleasant, which was both reassuring and mortifying because it confirmed they definitely discussed my weird behaviour. She remembered my order from the previous day without me having to specify, which was impressive and also made me feel like maybe the situation wasn't completely irredeemable. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I actually developed a friendly rapport, and the initial awkward incident became something we could laugh about. She told me that her first day training had been full of confusing interactions, and that my case of mistaken identity wasn't even the weirdest thing that happened. This made me feel slightly better, though I suspect she might have been being generous to spare my feelings. Marcus still gives me grief about the incident occasionally, referring to it as the time I apparently thought all baristas looked the same. I've learned to laugh it off and accept that this is now part of my regular customer identity at this coffee shop. I've also made a firm rule about putting my phone away completely before I reach the counter, because apparently I cannot be trusted to pay attention to basic details like who I'm talking to when I'm distracted by a screen. That story reminds us that our daily routines can make us so comfortable that we stop actually paying attention to our surroundings, and that assuming we know what's happening without looking can lead to interactions that range from awkward to mortifying. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that trying to be resourceful during a minor household emergency can spiral into a situation that makes you question every decision you've ever made. I live alone in a small apartment, which means I'm responsible for handling all my own maintenance issues and household problems without being able to rely on a roommate or partner to provide a second opinion on my choices. Most of the time this works out fine, but occasionally my problem-solving skills lead me down paths that seem logical in the moment, but reveal themselves to be spectacularly misguided once everything plays out. Today was absolutely one of those occasions, and I'm still processing the full scope of my poor judgment. The situation started this morning when I was getting ready for work and realised I'd run out of contact lens solution. This wouldn't normally be a crisis, but I'd fallen asleep wearing my contacts the night before, which meant they were uncomfortably dry and stuck to my eyeballs in a way that made removing them without solution basically impossible. I checked my bathroom cabinet, hoping to find a backup bottle I'd forgotten about, but there was nothing. I briefly considered just leaving my contacts in for another day, but they were irritating enough that I knew I'd be miserable if I didn't take them out and give my eyes a break. My first instinct was to just run to the pharmacy before work and buy more solution, but when I checked the time, I realised I was already running late and didn't have the margin to make an extra stop. I needed to solve this problem immediately with whatever resources were currently available in my apartment. This is where my decision-making process should have involved more careful consideration, but instead I let panic and time pressure override my common sense. I stood in my bathroom trying to think of what could possibly work as a substitute for contact lens solution. I knew that saline solution was basically salt water, so my brain started working through what household items might replicate that composition. I remembered reading somewhere that in emergency situations people had used various liquids to temporarily store contacts, though I couldn't recall the specific details of what was actually safe versus what was just internet folklore. Looking around my bathroom, I saw a bottle of eye drops that I sometimes use for allergies. The logic my brain constructed was that if these drops were safe to put directly in my eyes, they should theoretically be safe for soaking my contacts temporarily. This reasoning had some significant flaws that I would come to understand very shortly, but in the moment it seemed perfectly sound. I filled a clean contact lens case with the eye drops and carefully removed my contacts, placing them in the makeshift solution while mentally congratulating myself on my resourcefulness. I put on my backup glasses, finished getting ready for work, and headed out feeling like I'd successfully navigated a minor crisis. The plan was to stop by the pharmacy during my lunch break, get proper contact lens solution, and rinse my contacts thoroughly before putting them back in. Everything seemed fine until I actually opened my contact lens case during my lunch break and discovered that my contacts had essentially dissolved into weird, shriveled little protein clumps that looked nothing like functional lenses. I stared at the contact lens case in the pharmacy parking lot, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The eye drops I'd used apparently contained some ingredient that was fine for brief contact with eyes, but absolutely devastating to the material. Contacts are made from when used as a soaking solution. My contacts hadn't just been damaged, they'd been fundamentally destroyed by their morning bath in allergy eye drops. I was now wearing my backup glasses with no backup contacts, and I'd have to order new ones and wait for them to arrive. The frustration of this situation was compounded by the fact that I'd created this problem entirely through my own misguided attempts at problem solving. If I'd just been 10 minutes late to work and stopped at a pharmacy that morning, I would have spent maybe $5 on contact solution and moved on with my life. Instead, I'd destroyed a pair of contacts that would cost over $100 to replace and would take at least a week to arrive once I ordered them. I went into the pharmacy anyway and bought proper contact lens solution, which felt like a cruel joke since I no longer had any contacts to use it with. I also picked up the paperwork I needed to order new contacts, mentally calculating how long I'd be stuck wearing my glasses exclusively. My glasses are fine, but I prefer contacts for a lot of activities, and knowing I'd be glasses bound for at least a week because of my own stupidity made everything worse. When I got back to work, I had to explain to my co-workers why I was suddenly wearing glasses when I'd been wearing contacts that morning. I tried to keep the explanation vague, but my friend Jessica pressed for details, and I eventually had to admit that I'd accidentally dissolved my contacts in eye drops because I'd run out of proper solution. Her expression went through several stages of confusion before landing on barely suppressed laughter as she processed what I'd just told her. Jessica immediately started Googling whether this was something other people had done, and unfortunately for my dignity, it turns out that using eye drops to store contacts is a relatively common mistake that numerous people have made and regretted. There are entire forum threads dedicated to discussing why this doesn't work and sharing stories of dissolved contacts. Reading through these accounts while sitting at my desk made me feel simultaneously less alone in my stupidity and more embarrassed that I'd made such a well-documented error. The worst part was discovering that if I'd just used regular tap water, my contacts probably would have been fine for the few hours until I could get to a store. Tap water isn't ideal for contact storage because it can introduce bacteria, but for short-term emergency use, it's vastly preferable to eye drops that literally dissolve the lens material. I'd overthought the problem and landed on a solution that was worse than just using the most obvious available option. My co-worker Mike, who overheard the conversation, felt compelled to share that he once tried to clean his contacts with hand soap and had a similar experience of destroying them through misguided resourcefulness. This made me feel marginally better, though his story also involved getting soap in his eyes, which sounded even more unpleasant than my situation. We ended up having an impromptu discussion about the dumbest household substitutions people had attempted, and apparently using shampoo as dish soap and vice versa are common mistakes that lead to various disasters. The financial sting of having to order new contacts was made worse by the fact that I'd just bought this pair about 2 months ago. I hadn't even been wearing them long enough to justify replacement, but now I had no choice because I'd chemically destroyed them in my bathroom sink. When I called to order new ones, the optometrist's office asked if I'd damaged my current pair, and I had to explain what happened. The person on the phone was professional, but I could hear the smile in her voice as she confirmed my prescription and told me the new contacts would arrive in 7 to 10 business days. I spent the rest of the afternoon getting readjusted to wearing glasses full time, which involved remembering all the minor annoyances that come with frames. They slide down my nose when I look down at my computer, they fog up when I drink hot coffee, and they create this physical barrier that I'm not used to dealing with anymore. Every small inconvenience reminded me that this was entirely my own fault and completely avoidable. When I got home that evening, I threw away the bottle of eye drops that had destroyed my contacts, partly out of spite and partly to prevent any future version of myself from making the same mistake. I also bought 3 backup bottles of proper contact lens solution and placed them strategically around my apartment so I would never again be in a position where running out would seem like an emergency worth improvising solutions for. My roommate from college called that evening, and I ended up telling her the whole story. She laughed for a solid minute before composing herself enough to say that this was exactly the kind of thing she'd expect from me based on our years of living together. She reminded me of the time I tried to use regular glue to fix a broken mug and ended up creating a toxic situation when I heated it in the microwave, which was fair because I'd apparently learned nothing from that experience about not improvising with household chemicals. The next week of wearing glasses exclusively was a constant reminder of my poor decision-making. Every time someone asked why I wasn't wearing contacts, I had to decide whether to tell the truth or make up a less embarrassing reason. Most of the time, I went with a vague explanation about needing to give my eyes a break, which was technically true, even if it omitted the part about destroying my contacts through chemical misadventure. That story teaches us that sometimes the most obvious solution is the right one, and that trying to be clever with household substitutions can lead to expensive mistakes that could have been avoided by just being late to work or accepting temporary inconvenience. Our next story comes from someone who learned that trying to create an impressive first impression at your girlfriend's family dinner can backfire catastrophically when you misunderstand a fundamental detail about the evening's plans. I've been dating my girlfriend Emma for about 4 months now, and things have been going really well. We've reached that point in the relationship where meeting each other's families feels like a natural next step rather than a terrifying milestone. Emma had been talking about introducing me to her parents for a few weeks, and we'd finally settled on having dinner at their house this past Saturday evening. She'd mentioned several times how much her family loved hosting dinners and how her mum was an amazing cook, which made me want to bring something impressive to contribute to the meal. I'm not particularly skilled in the kitchen, but I do make one dish that people consistently compliment, which is this elaborate homemade lasagna that takes several hours to prepare properly. The recipe involves making pasta from scratch, creating a complex meat sauce with like 12 different ingredients, and layering everything with multiple types of cheese. It's genuinely delicious when done right, and I figured showing up to meet Emma's family with this impressive homemade dish would demonstrate that I was thoughtful, skilled, and serious about making a good impression. I spent most of Saturday afternoon in my kitchen preparing this lasagna masterpiece. I made the pasta dough and rolled it out by hand, simmered the meat sauce for 2 hours to get the flavours right, and carefully assembled everything in my nicest baking dish. The whole process took about 4 hours, but the end result looked and smelled absolutely amazing. I felt genuinely proud of what I'd created and was confident that Emma's family would be impressed by the effort I'd put into contributing to dinner. I carefully wrapped the lasagna in foil, placed it in an insulated carrier bag to keep it warm, and drove to Emma's parents' house, feeling good about how the evening was going to unfold. Emma had texted me their address earlier and mentioned that dinner would be around 6:30, so I timed everything perfectly to arrive with a still warm lasagna that could be served immediately. I was running through conversation topics in my head and feeling nervous but prepared for meeting her family. When I arrived at the house, Emma answered the door and her face went through this complicated sequence of emotions that I couldn't quite read. She looked surprised, then confused, then something that might have been concern or possibly suppressed laughter. She welcomed me in warmly enough, but something about her energy felt off in a way I couldn't identify. I figured she was just nervous about the family introduction and didn't think too much about it. Emma's parents came to greet me in the entryway, and they were incredibly warm and friendly, which helped ease some of my nervousness. Her dad shook my hand enthusiastically, and her mum pulled me into a hug, both of them saying they'd heard so much about me and were excited to finally meet. I felt my confidence returning and was about to mention the lasagna I'd brought when Emma's mum said they were just about to sit down for dinner and that I should come join them in the dining room. I followed everyone into the dining room, carrying my insulated bag with the lasagna, and that's when I saw the table and understood with dawning horror exactly what had happened. The dining room table was elaborately set with nice dishes, wine glasses, and several covered serving dishes that were clearly filled with food. Emma's mum had obviously prepared a complete meal for this dinner, and I was about to produce my own entire main course that would either have to replace her cooking or exist awkwardly alongside it. Emma's mum started bringing out the dishes she'd prepared, and of course the centrepiece of her meal was an absolutely beautiful homemade lasagna that looked professionally made and was garnished with fresh herbs. She set it down on the table with obvious pride, mentioning that she'd made her special recipe because Emma had told her it was one of my favourite foods. I stood there holding my insulated bag with my own lasagna inside, trying to figure out how to navigate this situation without making things incredibly awkward. Emma caught my eye and I could see that she'd realised what I'd brought and was trying to silently communicate something. But I couldn't tell if she was telling me to hide the lasagna or just apologising for not warning me that her mum was planning to make the same dish. The panic in her expression suggested this was as unexpected for her as it was for me, which meant she probably hadn't told her mum that lasagna was my favourite food, which meant her mum had just randomly chosen to make lasagna on the same night I decided to bring lasagna. Emma's dad asked what I had in my bag, and I realised I couldn't just pretend I hadn't brought anything without seeming weird for carrying around an insulated carrier. I had to come clean about the lasagna situation. I explained that I'd wanted to contribute to dinner and had spent the afternoon making my own lasagna, not knowing that Emma's mum had also prepared one. I tried to frame it as a funny coincidence, rather than an awkward disaster, but my voice probably betrayed how mortified I actually felt. There was a brief moment of silence where everyone processed this information, and then Emma's mum started laughing in this genuine, warm way that made me feel slightly less terrible. She said it was the sweetest thing that I'd gone to so much effort, and that clearly great minds think alike when it comes to dinner planning. Her dad joked that they were going to have a lasagna taste test competition, which actually helped break the tension and made the situation feel less catastrophic. Emma's mum insisted that we should serve both lasagnas and let everyone try each one, turning it into a fun comparison rather than an awkward redundancy. I brought my lasagna into the kitchen and we ended up plating portions of both versions side by side, which definitely wasn't how I'd envisioned this evening going. My carefully planned impressive gesture had turned into an unintentional cooking competition between me and my girlfriend's mother during our first meeting. As we started eating, the situation got even more complex because everyone felt obligated to comment on both lasagnas and compare them, which meant Emma's family was trying to be polite about my cooking while also not insulting her mum's meal. The comments were all very diplomatic, with people finding different things to praise about each version. Her dad said mine had a more robust meat sauce, while her mum's had better pasta texture. Emma's younger brother said they were both good, but in different ways, which was the kind of non-answer you give when you're trying not to take sides. The truth was that Emma's mum's lasagna was objectively better than mine. Her pasta was thinner and more delicate, her cheese layers were more evenly distributed, and her sauce had this depth of flavour that suggested she'd been making this recipe for decades and knew exactly how to perfect it. My lasagna was good, but it was clearly the work of someone who makes the dish maybe twice a year versus someone who's been feeding a family with it for years. About halfway through dinner, Emma's mum asked me questions about my recipe and preparation method, and we ended up having this actually pleasant conversation about cooking techniques and ingredient choices. She gave me some tips about how she achieves certain flavours and textures, and I realised that what could have been a mortifying competition had somehow turned into a bonding moment. She seemed genuinely touched that I'd put so much effort into bringing something homemade, even if the timing had created an awkward situation. The evening ended up going well, despite the double lasagna disaster. Emma's family was gracious and funny about the whole thing, and by the end of dinner we were all laughing about the coincidence and making jokes about how their family dinners always involved too much food anyway. Her dad said I'd set a high bar for future visits, and that next time I should check the menu first, which was fair advice that I would definitely be following. As Emma walked me to my car later that evening, she apologised for not warning me about the dinner plans, explaining that she'd had no idea her mum was making lasagna and that the whole situation was just incredibly unfortunate timing. She said her family really liked me and thought the lasagna incident was endearing rather than embarrassing, which helped me feel better about how everything had played out. She also mentioned that her mum had asked for my recipe, which I chose to interpret as a genuine compliment rather than a polite gesture. The leftover lasagna situation was its own adventure, because both families now had way too much of the same food. Emma's mum sent me home with containers of both versions, insisting I should have some of each to compare at home. I ended up eating lasagna for 4 days straight and giving away portions to neighbours and co-workers, all while explaining the story of how I'd accidentally entered a lasagna competition with my girlfriend's mother. That story shows us that sometimes our attempts to impress people lead to awkward situations that reveal more about our character than a perfect evening ever could, and that good people will find the humour in coincidences rather than letting them become disasters. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that overthinking a simple task while sleep deprived can transform a routine errand into an embarrassing display of confusion that multiple strangers had to witness. I haven't been sleeping well lately because my upstairs neighbours have decided that 3 a.m. is the perfect time to rearrange their furniture every single night. Between the constant scraping sounds and occasional thuds, I've been averaging maybe 4 hours of actual sleep per night for the past 2 weeks. This chronic exhaustion has left me operating in a perpetual mental fog, where simple tasks require way more concentration than they should, and my brain occasionally just stops processing information correctly. Today, that sleep-deprived mental state led to a situation at my local post office that I will be cringing about for years. I needed to mail a package to my sister for her birthday. Nothing complicated, just a box with some gifts that I'd wrapped and labelled the night before. The post office is literally 3 blocks from my apartment, and I've mailed packages there dozens of times without incident. This should have been a 15-minute errand that required minimal mental energy, but my exhausted brain apparently had other plans. I walked into the post office carrying my package and joined the line of about 5 people waiting for service. The office has this number ticket system where you're supposed to take a ticket when you enter and wait for your number to be called, but in my sleep-deprived state I completely missed this detail. I just stood behind the last person in what I assumed was a regular queue, zoning out and thinking about how desperately I needed a nap. After standing there for maybe 3 minutes, a postal worker called out a number that definitely wasn't in the sequence of people I could see waiting. Someone from the seating area got up and went to the counter, which confused me because I thought they'd been sitting down to wait for something else. My tired brain tried to make sense of this unexpected development, but couldn't quite connect the dots about the ticket system I'd failed to notice. I continued standing in my imaginary line, watching as people who'd arrived after me kept getting called to the counter. Each time this happened, I felt more confused and slightly annoyed that the postal workers seemed to be serving people in completely random order. After about 10 minutes of this, I was the only person still standing in the line area, while everyone else had either been served or was sitting in the waiting chairs. A postal worker finally made eye contact with me and asked if I had a ticket. This question hit my exhausted brain like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I looked down at my package, wondering if she meant, did I have a ticket attached to it? Maybe some kind of shipping label I'd forgotten to fill out. I told her I had the package I needed to mail, holding it up as if to prove its existence. She repeated the question, asking if I'd taken a number ticket when I came in. That's when I finally noticed the ticket dispenser by the door and understood that I'd been standing in a non-existent line for the past 10 minutes, while everyone else had been following the actual system. My face got hot as I realised how confused I must have looked. Just standing there, watching people get served while I waited for an imaginary queue to advance. I walked over to the ticket dispenser, which was when my sleep-deprived brain decided to really showcase its dysfunction. The dispenser had a simple button that you press to receive a ticket, but I somehow got it into my head that I needed to input information first. I stood there staring at this ticket machine, looking for a screen or keypad that didn't exist, trying to figure out how to tell it what kind of service I needed. An elderly woman who'd been watching this entire situation unfold came over and very gently pressed the button for me, causing a ticket to print out. She patted my arm sympathetically and suggested I might want to sit down until my number was called. I thanked her while dying internally, took my ticket and found a seat where I could avoid making eye contact with anyone. My ticket number was 87 and the display currently showed that they were serving number 72. I settled in to wait, using the time to rehearse in my head how I would handle the actual mailing transaction without further embarrassing myself. This mental preparation lasted until they called number 87 and I confidently walked up to the counter, only to realise I'd left my package sitting on the chair I'd just vacated. The postal worker watched as I spun around, spotted my package across the room, and had to walk back to retrieve it, while a small line of people with actual ticket numbers waited behind me. I grabbed the package and returned to the counter, apologising and making some weak joke about needing more coffee, as if caffeine could fix whatever was wrong with my brain at that moment. The postal worker asked me what I needed to mail and where it was going, which were straightforward questions that somehow became complicated when they left my mouth. I said I needed to mail the package to my sister, but when she asked for the address, I completely blanked on the street name. I knew my sister's address. I'd written it on the package label just last night, but standing there at the counter with multiple people waiting behind me, I couldn't retrieve this basic information from my memory. I stood there in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 seconds, staring at the postal worker, while my brain frantically searched for my sister's address. Finally, I remembered that I'd written it on the package itself, and could just read it from there. I picked up the box and started reading off the address, only to realise that my handwriting from last night was nearly illegible, and I was squinting at it, trying to decipher my own letters. The postal worker waited patiently while I struggled to read the address I'd written. At one point, she suggested maybe I'd like to rewrite it more clearly, which was a polite way of saying my labelling was completely inadequate. She provided me with a new label and a pen, and I moved to the side counter to write out the address again. This time, with my phone open to my sister's contact information, so I could copy it accurately. While I was rewriting the address, I somehow managed to knock over the pen holder on the counter, sending about 15 pens clattering onto the floor and rolling in different directions. Several people in line helped me pick them up, which was kind but also meant even more witnesses to my ongoing disaster of an errand. I thanked everyone profusely while gathering pens and wondering if I should just abandon the package and try again on a day when I'd actually slept. I returned to the counter with my properly labelled package, and the postal worker asked if I wanted to insure it or add tracking. This should have been a simple yes or no question, but my exhausted brain treated it like a complex philosophical inquiry. I stood there weighing the options as if I was making a major life decision, rather than just choosing whether to pay $3 extra for peace of mind. The postal worker waited while I deliberated silently, probably wondering if I needed medical attention. Eventually, I said yes to tracking, but no to insurance, though I immediately second-guessed this decision and asked if I could change it. The patient postal worker said yes and added insurance to the shipment. Then I asked how much everything cost, and when she told me the total, I pulled out my wallet, only to discover I'd somehow left my credit cards at home. I had cash, but not enough to cover the shipping cost, which meant I'd have to use the ATM in the corner of the post office. The postal worker told me to step aside so she could help the next person, and I shuffled over to the ATM, feeling like a complete disaster of a human being. The ATM required me to enter my PIN, which of course I momentarily forgot because my brain had apparently decided to stop retaining any information whatsoever. I tried 3 different number combinations before getting it right, withdrew cash and returned to the counter to complete my transaction. By the time I finally paid for shipping and got my receipt, I'd been in the post office for nearly 40 minutes for what should have been a 5-minute errand. Multiple people had witnessed various stages of my confusion, and the postal worker looked genuinely relieved when I finally left the building. I walked home replaying every awkward moment and wondering if I should find a different post office to use for future mailings. When I got home, I immediately looked up reviews for the post office to see if anyone else had mentioned the patient staff who deal with confused customers. Several reviews praised the workers for being kind and understanding with elderly clients or people having difficult days, which made me feel slightly better about being one of those problem customers they probably discussed during breaks. My roommate came home later and asked how my errand went. I gave him the full account of my post office disaster, and he laughed but also expressed genuine concern about my sleep situation. He suggested I invest in earplugs or a white noise machine, which was practical advice that should have occurred to me weeks ago before chronic exhaustion turned me into a person who can't complete basic tasks without creating a scene. That story reminds us that sleep deprivation affects us in ways we don't always recognize until we're standing in public struggling to remember basic information and completing simple transactions, like we've never interacted with society before. Our next story comes from someone who learned that trying to be spontaneously adventurous without proper preparation can lead to a humiliating outdoor experience that requires rescue from the most embarrassing possible source. I've been working from home for so long that I've started feeling like I'm turning into a hermit who never leaves the house except for grocery runs and the occasional coffee shop visit. My friends have been commenting that I need to get outside more and do something active, so when I woke up this past Sunday to absolutely gorgeous weather, I decided this would be the day I reconnected with nature and proved I wasn't completely sedentary. I'd been seeing all these posts on social media about people going on beautiful hikes and thought it couldn't be that hard to just pick a trail and walk around in the woods for a few hours. I did a quick search for hiking trails near me and found one that was described as moderate difficulty with scenic views, which sounded perfect for someone trying to ease back into outdoor activities. The trail was about a 40-minute drive from my apartment, and according to the website, it was a loop that took most people around 3 hours to complete. I figured 3 hours of walking sounded manageable, threw on some athletic clothes I hadn't worn in months, grabbed a water bottle, and headed out feeling proud of myself for being spontaneous and active. The first major oversight in my planning became apparent when I arrived at the trailhead and realised I was wearing completely inappropriate footwear. I'd put on a pair of old running shoes that I normally use for walking around my neighbourhood, not considering that actual hiking trails might involve terrain more challenging than flat sidewalks. The shoes had almost no tread left and were designed for pavement rather than dirt paths, rocks and roots, but I'd already driven 40 minutes to get there and wasn't about to turn back over something that seemed minor. The second oversight was that I'd brought a single small water bottle for what was, apparently, an 8-mile hike on a day that was rapidly getting much warmer than the weather forecast had predicted. The third oversight was not telling anyone where I was going or when I expected to be back, which is apparently hiking safety basics that I would have known if I'd done literally any research beyond finding a trail on a website. The hike started out fine, and I felt vindicated in my decision to get outside and be active. The trail was beautiful, winding through trees with occasional clearings that offered nice views of the surrounding area. I took several photos to post on social media later as proof that I was a person who did outdoor activities. For the first hour, everything seemed great, and I was congratulating myself on my spontaneous adventure. The problem started around the 2-hour mark when I realised the trail was significantly more challenging than I'd anticipated. The moderate difficulty rating apparently assumed you had actual hiking experience and appropriate gear, neither of which I possessed. There were sections that involved scrambling over rocks, navigating steep inclines, and crossing small streams using whetstones as stepping points. My worn-out running shoes were providing almost no grip on any of these surfaces, and I found myself moving increasingly slowly and carefully to avoid slipping. I'd also finished my water bottle about 90 minutes in, which meant I was now hiking the remaining portion of the trail with no hydration on a day that had gotten significantly hotter than expected. I started feeling lightheaded and realised I might have made some poor choices regarding preparation, but I was already committed to finishing the loop because turning back would mean covering the same difficult terrain I'd just navigated. The truly catastrophic moment came when I was trying to cross one of those small streams by stepping on wet rocks. I placed my foot on what looked like a stable stone. My shoe immediately slipped on the wet surface and I fell directly into the creek. The water wasn't deep, maybe a foot at most, but I managed to fall in the most awkward way possible, landing on my side and getting completely soaked from head to knee. My phone was in my pocket and was now thoroughly water damaged. My remaining dignity was gone, and I was still miles from the parking lot. I pulled myself out of the creek, checked my phone, and confirmed it was dead, and stood there dripping and trying to assess my situation. I was wet, tired, dehydrated, wearing inadequate shoes, and had no way to contact anyone because my phone had decided to permanently stop working. I'd gone from feeling proud of my spontaneous adventure to being a walking example of why people should prepare properly for outdoor activities. I continued along the trail because I genuinely had no other option, squelching with every step as my wet clothes chafed against my skin. The sun was helping dry me off slightly, but I was acutely aware that I looked absolutely ridiculous, covered in creek water and mud, limping along in shoes that were now even less functional than they'd been when they were just old and worn out. About 30 minutes after my creek incident, I encountered another hiker coming from the opposite direction. This was the first person I'd seen on the trail all day, and of course it had to be someone who witnessed me in my absolute worst state. He immediately asked if I was okay, probably because I looked like I'd been attacked by the forest itself. I explained that I'd fallen in a creek and was fine, but just trying to get back to the parking lot. He offered me water from his pack, which I accepted gratefully, while trying not to look as desperately dehydrated as I felt. This kind stranger asked if I wanted him to call anyone for me, since my phone was dead, and I had to admit that there wasn't really anyone to call because I hadn't told people where I was going. He looked concerned and offered to hike back toward the parking lot with me to make sure I made it safely, which was incredibly generous but also mortifying because it meant my failed adventure now required a rescue escort from a competent hiker who was probably judging every choice I'd made that day. We hiked together for the next hour, during which he gave me tips about proper hiking preparation that I absolutely should have researched before attempting this trail. He mentioned the importance of appropriate footwear, adequate water, telling people your plans, and checking trail difficulty ratings against your actual experience level. Every piece of advice was something I'd failed to do, and I felt progressively more foolish as the conversation continued. When we finally reached the parking lot, I thanked him profusely for helping me and apologised for requiring rescue on what should have been a simple hike. He was gracious about it and said everyone makes mistakes when they're starting out. Though I suspect my combination of poor planning and execution was exceptional, even by beginner standards. He made me promise to get proper hiking shoes and do more research before my next outdoor adventure, which I agreed to while privately thinking I might never hike again. The drive home was uncomfortable because my clothes were still damp, and I was acutely aware of how badly I'd miscalculated my outdoor abilities. When I got back to my apartment, I looked like I'd been through some kind of ordeal, which I suppose I had, just a completely self-inflicted one that could have been avoided with basic preparation. My roommate was home and immediately asked what had happened when she saw my appearance. I had to explain the entire saga of my failed hiking adventure, from the inappropriate shoes to the creek incident requiring rescue from a stranger. She listened with increasing amusement, and then asked why I hadn't just started with an easy trail, close to home, instead of jumping directly into an 8-mile moderate hike. This was an excellent question that I had no good answer for. The aftermath included having to buy a new phone, throwing away my ruined shoes, and accepting that I'd learned an expensive lesson about the importance of preparation and realistic self-assessment. My social media posts about reconnecting with nature never materialised because all my photos were on my dead phone, which was probably for the best since they would have required explaining why I looked increasingly distressed in each subsequent picture. That story teaches us that spontaneity is great, but should probably be combined with at least minimal research and preparation, especially when the activity involves physical challenges in environments where you can't easily quit if things go wrong. That's where we'll pause for the night, everyone. These tales of relatable chaos remind us that we're all just stumbling through life, making questionable decisions and learning expensive lessons. If you enjoyed this batch of Reddit mishaps as much as I did, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you here again for another cozy night of Reddit and Stardew soon. Thanks for listening, and sweet dreams.